This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Welcome listeners, it's Stu here, your host of the Thrive Today podcasts. Just before we jump into this episode of Thrive Perspectives, we have some really big news. We're excited to launch our crowdfunding campaign to build the Thrive Today app, a one-stop platform for daily inspiration, biblical insight, and transformative teaching. This app will bring together everything you love: Thrive podcasts, daily Bible reading guides, teaching video series, and a growing library of meaningful resources designed to deepen your faith journey. But we can't do it without you. To make this vision a reality, we need to raise $30,000. The build won't begin until the full amount is raised, and if we don't reach our target by the end of January 2026, every donation will be refunded in full. So your support is absolutely vital. Will you partner with us? If so, simply visit our website, thrivetoday.tv, click the app crowdfunding link at the top. You can then select your level of support. We'll keep you updated on progress as we seek to raise the funds needed by the end of January 2026. Welcome to today's episode of Thrive Perspectives. This is Stu, your host, and today we continue our series, Big Ideas That Change the World. Our title today is The New Universe, where we dive into the fascinating world of ideas that still shape our understanding of reality. There was a time when mystery wasn't a problem to be solved, but a truth to be honoured. When our place in the universe wasn't something to escape or redefine, but to accept as sacred, given, and good. So what drove the change from wonder to skepticism? From reverence to rationalism? From listening to the heavens to harnessing the world for our own ends? What led us away from embracing the divine order to questioning everything, mastering everything, even each other? How did the philosophy of splitting reality into mind and matter impact our understanding of the world, our existence, and purpose? These ideas have and continue to inform our understanding of knowledge, reality, and the human person. So, let's join Matt and Connell as we discuss these ideas and how they shape our worldview today. Well, good morning, Matt, and good morning, Connell. Welcome back from the US of A. He is back.
Made it back in one piece. In one piece,
he did.
Just.
And a great trip, I hear. You were over there with your daughter, who was presenting a paper at a psychology conference, I believe, in San Antonio. And
that's right.
And then did a bit of a trip around. So great to have you back. We missed you, and particularly, actually, we missed the coffees. But thank you for bringing them in this morning. We really, really appreciate that. On a cold, wintry morning, which Matt is enjoying very much.
I love a mist. I was saying before, a misty morning.
Misty morning.
Something mystic about a mist.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah. Well, listeners, welcome. Thrive Perspectives. Great to have you joining us again. We are going to continue our series on big ideas that change the world. Picking up from where we finished with discussion around the Reformation, we're going to be moving into what we're titling for this episode, The New Universe, as we look at the transition of ideas from Descartes to Newton. We look at the 30-year wars that came as a result of the Reformation and how that's actually shaped the way we think and see our world today.
Yeah, and I think what we're going to talk about today, we're going to move into the world of modern philosophy. And sometimes as a teacher of philosophy, people ask, how is that relevant to the Christian faith? And my response is always that the way that you think, the way that we think, invariably is shaped by these trends in modern philosophy that lead to a sort of
interpretation.
Kind of intellectual air that we breathe and that we're shaped by without even knowing it.
Yeah.
So, I think this is where this is important. Now, we're going to do broad brushstrokes today, but coming out of the Reformation, Stu, in the last episode, we talked about the way that essentially the Reformation kind of broke the monopoly of the Catholic Church in the West, in Europe. This leads to a kind of fragmentation. Now, that culminates in the 30 Years' War which is one of the single most horrible pieces of mass carnage. I think it's fair to say that, and we were just saying off mic before, like remarking at how absolutely horrible the 30 Years' War actually was.
And yet at the same time, probably also most transformative.
Yeah.
Devastating, and yet really changed the world. Not that justifies it, but it was a massive transformation, which we're going to talk through, as a result of that.
Yeah. Well, in summary, it was a struggle over control of Europe.
Yeah.
Of course, when the, Protestant movement broke away from the Catholic Church, they ran off with all of their land as well.
Yeah.
So the Catholics are, obviously their response, this is being very simplistic, but their response is something like, hey mate, you can't just run off with our lands and our, so we're coming, we're coming back in to take back what's ours. So that leads to 30 years of the most horrible carnage. I think, what was the death toll?
Estimates between 5 and 8 million people. But I think important to remember, though, that we struggle today to put the church and the state together. We've got to remember that actually the government was the church.
Yeah.
So this is almost like countries fighting against countries for different ideologies, really, or faith systems. It's not like, well, why didn't the government step in and the church? It's like it's all one thing.
That's right. And they had become, and I would say, problematically intertwined.
Yeah.
And I think one of the, if you can talk about good things that come out of the 30 Years' War, sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. And this really got bad. If you're going to fight with the weapons of the world, that's just going to be a cycle that goes on and on and on. Yeah. And 30 years of war. Think of the carnage of the First and Second World War. Second World War, 6 years. Like, imagine that for 30 years.
Yeah.
And I know that's industrial warfare on a whole other scale. But still, it goes on and on and on because that's how violence works.
Yeah.
So I think the thing that got me, though, reading about the history in these wars, is it weren't just religious or ideological extremists. The people participating and even encouraging these wars and organising groups of people to fight against each other seem to be the kind of like the people that we look at, like Luther, that I would have thought, surely somebody like Luther who has started that whole process, understanding scripture, understanding what corruption looks like in the church, the need to get back to true personal faith in Jesus and getting back to the truth of scripture, would have ended up being part of these wars and encouraging them and organising them and part of the carnage that follows.
Yeah, to be fair to Luther, the 30 Years' War is a long time after he's gone. I think the thing there is that probably Luther didn't quite, to the full extent, extricate the church from the state. He was able to do. Now this episode isn't about talking about the 30 Years' War and how all that happened. But yes, it was actually probably the nonconformist movements that came, what you would describe as the radical Reformation. The Pietists on the continent, the Puritans in England, basically the groups of people that founded America and founded that on a separation of church and state. Now, remember, we said in previous episodes about that secular space being essentially a Christian invention, because in order to believe genuinely, there needs to be a sphere in which it's permissible not to believe. And so, as Larry Siedentop in his book Inventing the Individual says, the secular space is Christianity's gift to the world because it allows for this space of non-belief. Now, that kind of got somewhat wiped out in the High Middle Ages, and even in Reformation Europe, you still had these essentially Catholic countries. In fact, even right into the 1800s, there were still very strong state churches. And, in Denmark, for example, in the 1800s, you had to be baptized to be a citizen. Yeah. So anyway, the point is, just imagine the result of this fighting, the fragmentation between Catholic and Protestant. You've got a situation where people are almost exhausted from this religious infighting. So over so long, this sort of disillusionment with religion in this form. And it's not surprising that people are going to look for
other answers,
a basis that feels more universal, right? Because everyone's got their own interpretation of Christianity. Now, we've said before, actually, Catholic and Protestant have more in common than they do difference. This is where the intertwining of this is complicated because it was largely political, really. Anyway, the point is, at this point, people are looking for something to unite. I mean, there are some countries that had Catholic and Protestant areas in the one country. So, like Holland, has Catholic areas and Protestant areas.
Ireland, most recently.
Yeah. So people are then looking for a basis. What is a basis of thought that can basically unite us?
It's not just opinion.
It's not just opinion. So reason then becomes that, people turn to reason. I mean, there's already a long philosophical tradition. I mean, the church has cultivated this. You've got the universities, like Paris and Oxford and so forth, that are fostering intellectual life. And so reason looks like a better sort of basis.
Yeah.
Now, one of the problems of this straight away is reason as a basis is problematic because, as I've said before, you always reason from a basis, from a foundation that can't itself be established by reason. Now, we know that now because essentially what is now referred to as the Enlightenment, which is this turn away from traditional authorities because they're all fighting each other, right? So we can't rely on that. That's a fractured foundation. We're going to turn to reason. This is the thing that can unite us. Aristotle defined humanity as a rational animal. Okay, so let's use reason. Let's come to a sort of common life through a common reason, right? Because that's what we have in common, right? Now, that sounds great, but as I said, to say this again, we always reason from a basis that can't itself be established by reason. Now, what they try and do during this period is establish that basis by reason. This is really problematic because reason is a closed circuit system, right? Because it's a closed circuit system, it can't establish its own existence in a sense, and it can't get out of itself in that sense. So I can reason from this certain foundation. Well, if this is the case, then that. So that's a classic kind of syllogism in reason. If this, then that. But the this that you start with
is an if.
Yeah, is an if, right? You have to. Something has to be given, right? So this is what essentially Descartes tries to do. First.
So Descartes in the middle of this 30-year war, really?
He's smack in the middle of the 30 years war.
Exactly right.
And he's seen as being the father of modern philosophy. Because essentially what he does is, right, okay, we're going to
move away from the church.
We're going to build everything up purely by reason, right?
Yeah.
So he sets himself this project. So he doubts everything. He says, I'm going to doubt everything. I'm even going to doubt that the external world around me, the world of the senses, I can, because it's actually possible to doubt that that's real.
Yeah.
So he's going to go right back to the foundations. He wants to rebuild reality or our conception of reality just through the use of reason. To just give you a bird's eye view of where this goes, the vision of reality that he ends up with ends up with quite a different vision of reality. So what he does is he decides, right, I'm going to doubt, let's say I'm plugged into the matrix, right? For those who are familiar with the matrix kind of idea. Now, his version of that is, how do I know that I'm not being deceived? I'm in some kind of dream.
Yes.
That I'm being constantly deceived by some evil demon that wants to deceive me. The matrix, right? How do we know we're not plugged in to the matrix? It became known as like the brain in the vat kind of thought experiment. Like, how do we know that all of this is real? So essentially, he does this. He begins with doubt. Now, this is important. This is an important moment because he's going to start with doubt. Famously, modern philosophy begins with doubt. I'm going to doubt everything. And I'm going to build up only what is essentially rationally indubitable.
Yeah, that's it.
Indubitable meaning I can't doubt it. Right?
Yes.
Or compelling. Now, this is important because our whole modern system of scholarship, from history and science and archaeology, and it's based on this methodological doubt, right? If it can be doubted,
until proven,
it sits in a sort of abeyance, a state of abeyance, right? I was listening to some lectures from Yale on New Testament, and the New Testament lecturer in this class at Yale University wrote on the board in Latin, doubt everything. We're going to assume that all of this is not true, and let's try and recover what we think is true here in the New Testament. What a basis on which to, and of course, he's adopting a methodology. He's not reasoning to that methodology. He's reasoning from that methodology. Right. And this begins with Descartes.
You're actually not doubting one thing. You're assuming that your capacity to reason is already
flawed.
Your starting point is that you're capable of reason, and you're not doubting that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And actually, when I was reading about Descartes, one of the comments he made is I think he acknowledged that. He was a Catholic, he believed in God. So
all these people that we're going to talk about are at least nominally Christian.
Yes. One of the statements that he made was that given that God's given him the ability to reason and is conscious, that it would make no sense for God to therefore make him unable to reason. I'm not expressing it as well as what he did, but that was the general gist of it. He at least acknowledged that starting point was actually rooted in the fact that God wouldn't have given me the ability to reason or experience reality if none of this was even real.
Okay, so let me put it this way. As a Christian, he wants to get to the same place, right?
He just wants to do it through reason.
But he wants to get there by reason. Now, this has affected the whole enterprise of apologetics. It's trying to lead people there by reason. Now, that is enormously problematic. You can't, because again, mind is a closed circuit system. It can't get out of itself. So it naturally, and we'll get to this in the next episode, we naturally create a world that's a mirror of our mind. That's another thing that we'll get to. Anyway, so you're quite right. So what he does, he actually locks himself in a dark space, and he reasons through this, and he says, okay, I'm going to assume that everything around me is, how do I know that it's real? This is the problem of what's called solipsism. So he says to himself, well, for me to even ask that question and even think about it, that must mean that there is one thing that I can know for sure that exists, and that is me. In order to even doubt, there needs to be an I that can doubt. So he says, I think, therefore I am. That's the famous cogito ergo sum. Now, there's actually a problem. There's actually, as subsequent philosophers pointed out, even that's not quite. Hume is going to criticize that because he's going to say, well, it actually doesn't mean that there is an I. It just means that there's thinking. Right?
At least he acknowledged that, up front. That he has to start with that premise. That I'm able to think and my thinking is reasonable and rational.
Yeah.
And what I reason from that point is worth something.
Yeah. So it's essentially going to so think about what happens there, right? If it starts with me and I'm building reality from the bottom up with my reason, this is the beginning of essentially a human-centered approach to reality. This is human autonomy. This is autonomous reason, right? Reasoning up from the ground up, trying to get there. This is the new Tower of Babel of modern philosophy, right? We are going to build from the bottom up. We're going to arrive at God. This is enormously problematic. Now, the reason why we're even talking about this today, because we're still affected by this, right? If I can't get there, if it doesn't make sense to me, if I can't get there by reason, if I can't understand why God is doing this or why that or how that can exist with this, or it's so difficult for us in our cultural environment to accept that. You go back 500 years, 600 years, that would just seem stupid. Of course, we're never going to, how could we even think that we would ever be able to reason ourselves to that?
But it's worse now because at least back in the era of Descartes, everybody was a theist of some persuasion pretty much. Where nowadays, that starting point that we just talked about with Descartes of acknowledging the fact that God had to give that ability to reason and putting that as a starting point.
Well, we'll explain I'll explain in a moment why he does that. But anyway, because he reasons to that.
Yeah.
He doesn't accept it on faith.
Yeah.
He actually reasons to that.
Okay.
So reason is still primary for Descartes.
But I think nowadays, if you were to listen to the philosophers or scientists, they would actually not even acknowledge that as a starting point. And that's, I guess, where the humanistic aspect of it shifts from being a theistic foundation, becomes a humanistic foundation where it just starts with some undeclared assumption that human reason is actually worth even listening to. And that's probably the biggest problem with so many of how we approach it today and how it even affects us as Christians, because we'll often then go back to our reason and go, well, how do I know God exists? And then we try to reason.
Yeah, we
to
keep, we keep trying to reason ourselves out of our closed circuit system.
But in order to do that, you kind of have to then move even God's existence away as the starting premise. So what are you left with? Just human reason. And I don't, even with the limited reasoning then surely that you would be left with then, you'd have to reason that that's a pretty limited, pretty big constraint to be reasoning with, just human reason alone.
Yeah, and realistically, no one really does it. Even essentially, Descartes doesn't really even. Scientists don't even do it. They never reason from scratch.
But they don't acknowledge it.
And
even getting people to acknowledge that now.
Unacknowledged assumptions. Yes, that's right.
Because they're so convinced of their own ability to reason.
It's just pure reason and sensory experience.
Yeah, and even trying to get people to go, yes, but you're still starting with an unproven.
That's right.
Premise here.
That's right. Yeah.
They actually think you're being unreasonable.
All right, let's look at how Descartes gets to his new world to keep this moving before people lose the thread.
Yep.
Right. So he thinks to himself, right, I'm thinking, and he asks himself, is there something in the contents of my mind that can provide a sort of lever or something that will get me out of my own mind, right? That will get me out of the matrix in a sense. So he finds in his mind this idea of God and of supreme goodness and of supreme, and he thinks to himself, well, where does that idea come from? And I'm not going to go right into his argument. Basically, he reasons that because there are certain ideas in his mind that he reasons cannot come from an evil demon. Even behind an evil demon, there must, if it doesn't necessarily deny that such a thing can exist, but that behind that there must be a God for these ideas to exist in his mind. So the idea of God becomes a sort of lever to assure him, as you say, that there is this overarching controlling element that guarantees that my reasoning
is reasonable
and my senses, that my senses are not deceived, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So it's a version of what has already been known since Anselm's time. Anselm was a philosopher in the Middle Ages called the ontological argument, and people can look up the ontological argument. It's not a particularly convincing argument. It's an effort to use, again, the closed system of reason to get out of itself. And I don't think that can ever really happen, but they gave it a red hot go. Anyway, so essentially what he does, let's just, in summary, what Descartes does is that he gets rid of the world, right? I'm going to doubt everything, and I'm going to put the world back together through purely the use of reason. Now, the world that he ends up with after is in subtle but very important ways a completely different kind of world. Let me explain. Basically, what he does, he divides the world into subject and object, right? So I'm the subject, the world is an object. If I'm even asking that question, the reality of the external world, what that means is it isolates the thinking subject. So the thinking subject becomes the great observer of reality as an object. And I think about this object out there called reality, almost by putting the human mind at the center and starting with that, because everyone else previously, including Greek philosophers, started with some notion of God. It could be Plato's demiurge, could be Aristotle's prime mover, whatever version of that. The Stoic logos that's mentioned in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the logos, the word. Not that he was buying into Stoicism. No, he was trying to make a connection. Part of what he's doing is trying to make a connection. Anyway, let's not get into that. I mean, part of this is important because that concept of the logos did actually carry even right through Plato and Aristotle to some extent. It comes through to Stoicism, this idea that the view of the world was a view of a world that was essentially designed and upheld and guided in a very sort of mystical kind of way by this principle of reason. It was a kind of version of the logos, the mind of God in all things.
So it was less about dominating the world and more about kind of aligning yourself with its intrinsic order.
Yeah, that's right. So essentially you try to conform and understand. Yeah. Try to understand the pattern of the logos of the reason in the world. So this is a very mystical view of the world. Now, what happens with Descartes is essentially he gets rid of that. Rather than mind being something that I participate in that's already out there, it essentially monopolizes that idea for the individual. Essentially, it means that mind is here. I am a mind.
Yeah.
I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
And the world is just an object, right? It's just inanimate objects, right? There's no mind out there. That's just stuff. The mind is here. So essentially, it's putting human beings in this kind of position as God.
So it's like then the observer is greater than the object.
Essentially,
you're observing. And I guess what you were saying before with the more of the Stoic view, there's a mystery. You're still an observer, but you're observing it from the stance of observing something that's more mysterious and bigger. And
you're able to observe it because the mind with which you observe it is participating in a greater mind. It's a capacity that's imparted to you.
But you're looking at it from a sense of being smaller than that. You're the observer, but I'm smaller than the thing. Yeah, so I'm looking out into reality, but more with a sense of wonder and a sense of me being smaller.
Yeah, that's right.
A subset of that.
Yeah.
Where I guess where the word Descartes turning that around is he's the observer and is bigger than the reality in the sense that I'm the one who's conscious and reality is just
stuff.
It's just stuff. So in a sense, then I'm actually greater than reality in that sense.
Yeah. So previous to this, in summary, there's this, as I said, a slightly mystical view of reality. All reality is understood almost more organically as the emergence of something towards a particular end. This is the Aristotelian view of the universe, which dominates in universities actually well into the 1700s even. And it's this idea of a universe that is imbued with rationality, that is moving towards a certain end. There's design, it's moving towards a kind of final, it's
progressing.
Yeah, it's progressing. It's not just chance. It's not just objects. It's something much more organic. It's something like the way a seed. I mean, Aristotle reasons that a certain kind of seed will always become a certain kind of tree, right? And so he reasons from that to everything. So basically, everything is like that.
Purpose and design.
There's design. There's this principle of purpose. Let's call it principle of purpose in all things. Now, interestingly, in our time, philosophers are coming back to that, and philosophers and scientists are coming back to that. Scientists
a little slower,
but certainly philosophers like Thomas Nagel is probably one of the most prominent philosophers alive today. His book Mind and Cosmos is essentially a kind of neo-Aristotelianism.
That's a great. I just want to make a point here because I feel like some of our listeners might be getting lost in why do we need to know all of this? I think it's important to say the things we're talking about here actually shape the way we think in our world today. It's the way we approach faith. It's the way we approach life. It's the way we look at the world. Yeah. And in fact, it's the way that science has become the dominating way in which we determine what's real and what's not real and all those sorts of things. So we're not just talking about stuff for the sake of, this is actually what shaped our thinking in the modern age. And so this is why we're trying to work through this now, just in case our listeners are going, do I need to know all of this stuff?
I'll go even one step further, Stu, and I would say this has changed my life, understanding this, because it has enabled me to diagnose something that happens to me that has locked me inside my own head. Yeah. Right. I mean, we've talked about this stuff a lot.
It's the same with me. And I was just about to say that when you were talking this.
It's life-changing, right? Because it's like, I'm doing this thing where I'm trying to reason I'm trying to use this closed-circuit system to reason to something. And it's almost like I have this inherited unwillingness to accept something that I can't circumscribe rationally.
Yeah. There's a sense, though, that we could look at it and go, that's the problem with science. As if
there's nothing wrong with science. Science is fine.
Yeah, but it's like we kind of distance ourselves from, like, that's the problem with the atheists and science and so on. They've adopted this kind of humanistic worldview, and their reason is the thing that they use to understand the world. But I'm not like that. But I am like that. And that's the point. It's so pervasive in our culture.
Totally it is.
We're
that
deeply
it affects
like that,
everything. Yeah. And so I've seen it all through my life. And in terms of how I respond to God all the time, questioning, but why God? Why would you do that? Why would you do it this way? And it's like if I don't have an answer to that question, then I will doubt God. And I still would do that to this day. But I'm always looking at things and go, but why would you allow that to happen, God? Mm-hmm. And it's like, maybe God's not really there. And you could just feel the thing or questioning God all the time. Now, having diagnosed the problem within myself, I go, why do I think I would know why God would do that. Why do I expect to understand the reason
or even understand it
for why he would do or behave? And I don't know why God would do certain things a certain way, and therefore I have to sort of
the fact that you think that you should understand, and I'm not talking about you. I mean me too. This is it's this natural
it's all of us.
propensity to just struggle to accept things that we can't grasp rationally.
So what about accept this then? Accept the fact that expect to see God act in ways that are different to what you would have expected God to do, or expect God to be doing things in ways that you can't understand.
Yeah.
That isn't reasonable to you. If God is God, then I would expect God to be doing things that are actually seem unreasonable to me.
Yeah.
Because why should I be able to reason why God would do certain things?
This is. I mean, the Book of Job is all about this, and in fact, in our other podcast, Thrive Deeper, we're going to be moving on soon to the Book of Job.
Let me just clarify the word unreasonable there, because we tend to think of the word of unreasonable as being wrong.
Good point.
It simply means we can't reason it.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. And I think that's important.
This is an important point, Stu. Thanks for picking this up, because reason is a God-given capacity. Now, Blaise Pascal said, and you might want to look up his dates there quickly, Stu, but he's an important figure, very important mathematician, theologian and philosopher. He says reason's last step is to acknowledge that there are an infinite number of things that are beyond it. So acknowledging reason's limits is itself a rational thing to do. So I think that's an important point that Blaise Pascal makes.
He was in a similar zone, sort of 1618, 1648 kind of thing.
Yeah, similar
during the 30.
Yeah. In some ways, Pascal is, and interesting from the very start, is wanting to point to reason's limits. While Descartes doing his thing, you got Blaise Pascal that's saying reason is not going to get us there, right? So right from the start, you have these warnings. Anyway, so Descartes, the first thing he does is that it's a new concept of humanity, right? A human being as a thinking thing, as the great mind that apprehends and even comprehends, goes that further step. Medieval theologians believe that, yes, we apprehend reality with our minds. It's a God-given connection between our minds and reality. That's part of the whole logos thing, which medieval theologians actually picked up on and were happy to go with that aspects of that kind of idea from Greek philosophy. But they always admitted that we can never comprehend reality, right?
Yeah.
Because as you were saying before, because it's bigger. But, Descartes is essentially putting human beings at the center, creating a new notion of human beings as almost the slightly kind of all-knowing and being minds particularly. But he also changes the way that we see the universe, because if mind is no longer in the universe, now it is a believer in God, but we're actually going to end up with a slightly different view of God even. So what that means is the universe out there is just stuff, objects in space, right? Yeah. It's just objects in space. It's characterized purely by extension, right? So therefore it's mathematical in nature, right? It's objects and affecting other objects, cause and effect.
And we put our minds to work.
Billiard balls,
who give it order and purpose. It's our minds that give it order and purpose, as opposed to it having its own order and purpose. Maybe a step too far.
That comes a little later. That's going to be Immanuel Kant goes hard on that one. And we'll get to that because that's a very important point. But for the moment, you get this universe of objects in space that causally affect other objects. Now, the interesting thing is people still popularly think about the universe
like that.
In that way. This basically lays the groundwork for Isaac Newton, of course, right? The Newtonian universe is the big machine, right? Because he's mathematically exploring, and he was influenced by Descartes. If it's just objects in space and it's mathematical in nature, the relationship between these objects, we can analyze these objects with mathematics, then that becomes the foundation of what's known now as classical mechanics, right? Which creates a universe that's essentially like a big machine. It's cogs and wheels. Its objects in space affect all causally. Everything's, in a causal relation to other objects, right?
And it's predictable as well.
And it's predictable.
Entirely
That's right.
Predictable.
It's entirely predictable. So it's like a clock. You saw it something like a clock. Basically, it's a big clock. Now, Isaac Newton he's a Christian. He's a very strong Christian. In fact, for him, God is the maker of the machine. He kind of winds this machine up.
Yeah.
And it kind of runs on its own, which in a way that idea is okay, but this gradually leads to a new notion of God, essentially, as the slightly more distant God is. Yeah, it's essentially this leads to deism, right?
Yeah,
which is the God who sort of sits outside the universe. He makes the universe, he winds it up, it runs on its own. Every now and again, God kind of pops in to fix something or introduce a new element. I mean, even that, deists don't usually like that idea, but it's that notion of God, as this sort of being out there. And this is where you get the separation. In this period, you get the separation between the natural and the supernatural. Yeah. And you never really had that before. Think about it. Previous to this time, everything was supernatural. Everything was undergirded supernaturally, right? The divine logos in everything, right? Everything was supernaturally upheld. Now, well, the supernatural sits separately. It's sort of out there. And every now and again, they will, it doesn't take long for people to wipe out the supernatural, right? Because we don't even need that. Yeah. But the separation happens first, right? You've got the supernatural realm and God's there. Then the natural realm, that kind of works on its own. Theology understands the supernatural stuff about God, but the new science is going to analyze the world.
But I even think generally, as Christians, that's the model we work with. I think if you spoke to most Christians, we would see that. And certainly even in my head, that's probably changed in recent years. But in my mind, that's probably, I still would default to thinking of it as if God is distant. It just runs as it is. And that would be the explainer for maybe why doesn't God do certain things? Because he sits outside of it and it's like a machine and it's all running and he doesn't like to interfere with it. He lets the natural order run on its own. There's some truth in that. But I know myself, then it's a sense of, well, then God's out there and if I want him to change it, I have to invite him in to act upon it.
You're exactly right. We are, as one contemporary theologian says, and we've discussed this before, plenty of times, we are monopolytheists. Like we essentially have it's a god like Zeus that sits up there on his mountain and, pops in every now and again to fix things, but there's just one. But that's essentially what deism is. So the popular evangelical notion of God has often been criticized as, well, therapeutic deism, essentially. Yeah. I mean, this is important because I find myself as a Christian leader and teacher constantly feeling like I need to remind people about actually who and what God is. I mean, it's so basic. But we've slightly lost this idea of God as infinite and eternal in all of his being and attributes, which means that, we are constantly experiencing God all the time.
We're immersed. We're already
in God. Now, we've talked about this, so we don't...
Yeah, we have, but it doesn't seem like an unreasonable idea, that deistic idea. But the consequence of that is, from a Christian perspective, I think we do then push God away, create a separation in our own lives, and then we think that God isn't we don't feel immersed in God.
It's not the everyday.
Because God is out there.
He's out there.
Yeah. And then we
invoke him when we want him.
We picture him as like a person in the sky, almost like some sort of being or some sort of being who's there separate to where I am. In a way,
we read that into, because people might think, but don't we pray our Father in heaven, right? But again, we've read an idea into that, this idea that God lives somewhere else.
Or that heaven is somewhere else.
Speaking of God's transcendence, and it talks about the enmity between this realm of the world and the realm of God. It's a little more complicated. Yes. We're not going to talk about that now, but the point is, I mean, the classical theism meaning the theism that was clarified right through the Middle Ages to Thomas Aquinas, even into Calvin and the Reformers, basically says God creates and sustains and upholds all things by the word of his power, as the scriptures say, right? So, in other words, our very ability, the life that within us is a perpetual gift from God, a perpetual gift from God. We are experienced. We're in the middle of a miracle. We are that. We are being upheld and sustained by the power of God's word. Our consciousness, even our ability, ironically, to reason.
But we've lost our ability to be amazed. at the mystery of all
that's
of
right.
that. That's
because
the
we want to
problem.
be on the outside looking in. So, and this gets back to the subject-object problem that starts
Yes.
with Descartes, because reality now is an object that I think about, right? And I try and comprehend. And I'm somehow separated from that. So you get this subject-object problem that has plagued us since that time. That has plagued me. It's plagued all of us, right?
Yeah.
I use the word plague advisedly because it's this catching thing, because we have this God complex already in our heart, this tendency to want to be like God from Genesis chapter 3, from the fall onwards.
Yep.
I mean, we grab this sort of stuff, right? I'm not going to accept this unless I can comprehend it. This sense of the world being this object out there that I comprehend with my all-knowing mind it's addictive.
So to try to keep this moving, because I know we're looking at time, looking at Francis Bacon, who we mentioned briefly, and of course Newton, Francis Bacon's call for a practical empirical science and Newton's mechanistic kind of universe helped birth what we now call the scientific method.
Yeah, let me bring Francis Bacon into this, because this is around the same. He's just
same time,
a little
just before
earlier
Newton.
than Descartes.
And Newton.
And Newton. So Descartes before Newton. Francis Bacon is just a little bit before Descartes. So essentially, what Francis Bacon wants, and again, same period, same sort of environment, right?
Yeah.
He wants...
trying to solve a problem.
Yeah, he wants an approach to science that's less about speculating about grand theories of existence like the Logos and all of that. Look, everything that I've said today it's a bit of a simplistic kind of explanation, but basically saying we need to get away from all this high-level speculative and actually come up with a science that's actually useful, right? That we narrow down to just working with what we observe, right?
Which is fair enough.
Which is totally fair enough. Okay.
Yeah.
And so he founds a method. I mean, he and Galileo and others, but he's very instrumental in this, founding a method for science. This is the beginning of the scientific method that's based on observation and induction from observation. We start with what we observe. Whereas Descartes is the beginning of rationalism, a reason-centered approach. Alongside that goes Francis Bacon, who wants to work with an observation empirical, is the word for that, based on what we observe through the senses. So he's going to focus on that. Now, eventually that's going to lead, by the time you get to David Hume, and we'll talk about this in the next episode, they're going to want to narrow reality down to what can be observed, right? But there is only the empirical universe. But you see where it starts. It starts with, let's just focus on this. And the focus becomes this thing where we become so enamored with this powerful capacity that we have to understand and manipulate this chunk of reality that we decide that is all there is to reality.
But we're not being
Classic God
disparaging.
complex.
We're not being disparaging of scientific, because I wouldn't want scientific method to work any other way.
No, that's right.
That's the whole point of science.
But you've got to understand what it is.
But where we go wrong then is we make the scientific method the boundary of
reality
and what we can know. And if you subscribe to that idea, that's not scientific method. That's a philosophical worldview. It says I'm going to constrain what I know to only what can be demonstrated through scientific method. That's a problem.
So as science, this method kind of progressed, reason itself becomes instrumental, valued less for wisdom or virtue and more for its ability to control, predict and manipulate, really. That's what starts to happen here. And knowledge was no longer about what's good, but about what actually works, what we can explain.
Bacon's famous
manipulation.
Bacon's famous saying is knowledge is power. Knowledge needs to be, reason needs to be instrumental in it, in that we need to focus on instrumentalizing the physical world for look, again, he's working within a Christian framework, and he's saying this will enable us. It's reason that is given to us to enable us to subdue the earth. Now, I think that's slightly,
Stretch.
I think that's partly true, but it's, because again, you get what's known as the rise of instrumental reason, which is, actually all human reason apart from God essentially is instrumentalizing the world or envisaging the world in ways that put us in the center, that make us, in some sense, the all-powerful.
Which means then your ethics become rooted in human reason rather than in any kind of divine.
I mean, and this is a good point, Stu, because as the philosopher, this was Alistair McIntyre points this out, that this endeavor to wipe out the previous foundation, and we're going to we're going to now found everything on a reason, the project of reason. But basically, during the Enlightenment, they wanted to get to the same set of values, but we want to get there with reason alone. Now, he says, basically, we failed. Spoiler alert. What Descartes started, like, let's just use reason alone to order our lives, that is a disaster, right? It doesn't, they can never quite do that, right? Because again, of course they can't, because you can't reason outside of the closed system. But as Alistair McIntyre argues in his book, After Virtue, he says, well, the problem is that 200 years of that project, we completely cut ourselves off from the previous foundation. And now we're in all sorts of trouble because we've got no basis. We've got no basis for our ethical values. We still feel connected with these ethical values, but there's this constant project of trying to ground them, and we're still with that today. Like we're still trying to ground.
But it is a circular.
Values.
It's a circular thing. So you started off with God as the basis from which to reason. Then we reasoned, and we developed that, and then we subject God to our reason.
Yeah.
So that's where we come back to full circle. The original foundation that people like Descartes started with, as we follow the circle round and we're putting all of our faith in our ability to reason, we then take our reason and use our reason then to try to understand and reason a way to God, which is the starting point. So now we're just in this circular
and essentially
infinite loop.
You cut yourself off.
And we cut ourselves off from that starting point.
So here's the practical. Let me give a practical summary. Because as I said before, this has been life-changing for me. And I know I've shared this before, but I'll share it again because I think this matters so much, right? And I'm even talking as a Christian, right? I still found myself trying to reason my way to God in different ways, trying to understand. And I think deep down I knew that didn't work, but it was almost a kind of a psychological existential habit. This thing of, is he, like when you're praying, is God even really there? How do I know he's really there? It's the mind feedbacking on itself. And the amount of times, having had quite a dramatic conversion experience, I may say, like God came into my life, God grasped me. But what then happened is that I tried to grasp God. I tried to understand, and that did all sorts of harm. It'd be like overthinking feedback loop. Is he really there? Is this really real anyway? Was I deceived in the first place? I got locked in my own closed circuit system. Nowadays, I look at that and I think that was ridiculous. Of course you're going to get locked in a closed circuit system, right? There's a kind of human, it's like this pathological desire to work with that closed circuit system and not allow reality to be bigger than that. And it was me really diagnosing that and catching myself in that feedback loop, trying to understand, that led me to realize, no, actually, I need to come back and start with God. I start by acknowledging God. And honestly, I would say that the clearest thing to me now is this sense of before and after, me realizing that just doesn't happen. The immediacy of God, I've allowed myself to live in that. And, this constant sense of God that I connect with at a deep spiritual sense that I cannot even grasp with reason when I catch myself trying to do that. Now, again, I'm not throwing reason out the window. I believe that reason is a gift of God, but again, it's a closed circuit system. And to know God is to first of all recognize you are immersed in the presence of God. Your very life, your consciousness is already an ongoing experience of God. And there's an action of the will that needs to happen, a willingness to be grasped and overpowered and baffled by one who you cannot even begin to understand, but who loves you and is for you. And when you start to move with God, when you stop trying to comprehend it all, and when you focus on just moving with God, as the scriptures say, living by the Spirit, then that awareness opens up and deepens and becomes completely indubitable.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.